Hey, I'm Tiger. Welcome to my stream for the last time, most probably, in Train Sim World 2, since 2 days ago the early access phase for Train Sim World 3 started, and from what I've seen from the game, it is really cute. Hey AJ, thank you for moderating again. Like I said, most probably last time that we're starting the Train Sim World 2 here. Early access is open. That means we can run the core routes for the Train Sim World 3, but not the routes that still need to be imported from the Train Sim World 2 and before era. This will happen when the official start is sometime next week, and then we can use all our nice routes that we have here. Because today I wanted to look into the brake setup of freight trains and the PZB M regime, I needed to do it in Train Sim World 2. So, what are we going to do? We are dipping in Dresden Nahverkehr to run a freight train here. We need to go to Dresden or to the Alternatingly DLC, because those two are so far the only two DLCs that have freight trains with brakes that can actually be switched from G to P on the freight cars and on the locomotives even to R, and we need this to set up our train properly. So I picked a service that we will run with the Baureihe 143, a locomotive that was built en masse in the former German Democratic Republic, and after Germany reunited, the Deutsche Bahn ended up with a lot of those thingies, and well, they have been reconfigured. There are several different versions of those machines, and they were used for a lot of things, pulling dostos and pulling freight trains as well. I picked the service because we can actually see a lot of things that are interesting. This is the interior of our Baureihe 143. We can see that it is a vehicle that still has the old MFA 7 cab with the rectangular indicators and a lot of buttons and thingies that we will look into later. Our brake system here, and in the game there are several versions of the Baureihe 143, and at least the two in Dresden and Rampe, a lot of those things are actually working. So, before we set up our locomotive, we have to go down this narrow aisle and go to this panel, where we can set up a lot of things that we need to set up to run our train a bit more realistically than just running it with the pre-configured configuration. This being said, everything and all what we do here is always just simulation. Everything is so much more complicated in real life. I wouldn't have the faintest idea to talk about real life. I just can, well, look into directives and stuff that you can read how it is supposed to be, and watch videos on YouTube where things are being explained. But nevertheless, it is always good to look a bit, at least, behind the scenery and to try to understand what is happening here. So what is happening here on this panel? We can raise the pantograph, we can charge the battery. All this has already been done in this locomotive. What still needs to be done is to set up the security systems and the brakes. We can see this thingy over there. It is named Steuerventil, regulator valve or something like this, and this is the GPR brake selector, where we can select our brake settings. G, P and R. What that means, we will look into it later. We have the selector for our PZB mode. We have, if you have watched my streams before, already discussed the PZB O mode, obere, upper regime. We have already discussed the PZB U mode, untere, lower class for the heavy freight trains, and there is still for us to do the medium one. So this is where our selector is going to end up. But why it is going to end up here, we will have a look at it a bit more closely. So far we have always just taken what was ordered to us to run, and now we will look why we will be ordered to run this train in PZB M mode. The CFA obviously needs to be turned on, the PZB needs to be turned on, and this selector will end up in G. And why in G? We will have a look at this, but first we will have a look at our cars. We have a freight train that is... Can I not jump out here? What is the problem? Maybe because I was... if you crouch you cannot jump out of the doors. Interesting fact. CFA is the Sicherheitsfahrschaltung, that is a vigilance device. That is, some sort of a device that checks if the driver pushes a pedal or a button at least every like 90 seconds. I don't know actually if it's 90 seconds or 60 seconds. And if the driver or engineer fails to do that, then at first a light will light up and then you will hear a warning sound. And if you ignore that and don't press your pedal, then the train will go into a penalty brake. So, those are the cars that we are pulling. They are cars that are flatbed cars where you can put those containers on. And we have like 10 or 20. Depends on how you count that. It looks like one car starts here and ends here, and then the next car starts, but that is not so. Actually, you can see that here we have two parts of the cars connected with one bogie. So here this one ends in this bogie and the other one starts in this bogie, and here we cannot actually uncouple those cars in between. What will be interesting for our calculations later. Here we have actually a coupling that we could uncouple and separate the train in between. Not so with the other one. So we have actually vehicles that come in pairs. We have an A part and an B part. Those are so-called articulated cars because they have this one Jakobsdrehgestell, this one bogie in the middle that is used by both halves of the car. We have actually a lot of things on those cars that we can actually use, like the handbrakes or this distributor release valve. We could release the brakes on these cars by pulling here. There is a thing, lever where we can cut out the brake of this car if it is, well, defective for any reason, so that we can still run the train. We won't have this brake braking, but at least it does not interfere with our train. And the most important thing here that we have is this brake selector. We can put it into P and we can put it into G. So why is this important? We will see in a short while in our theory session. There are a lot of markings, a lot of indications on those cars, and in real life they are extremely important, because you have to imagine that those freight cars, they travel a lot, not only in Europe from one end to the other, but some even further, and they need to be serviced and handled by a lot of different people from different backgrounds, and every railroad worker needs to be able to know what this lever is supposed to do and this one, and not everyone understands English or German, or I think this is Czech what is here written on the car. So there needs to be some kind of unification so that people understand what those levers and markings stand for. And there is an organization actually where railroad enterprises made a treaty to make sure that all the freight cars can run across Europe back and forth and can be handled in the same way. And for example, the brake lever here is always a lever that has a ball on top of it, so that even if it is dark and you cannot read what it says here on the marking, you just take this lever in your hand and you feel a ball and you feel, this is the brake selector where I can change between G and B. The same here for the cutout switch. It is like a loop. If you feel that in your hand, you know, this is the switch for cutting out the brake, and so on. Then there are markings that tell you how fast this car can go. This is in this table here on different qualities of track, A, B, C, D, with D being the best, A being the worst. It tells you how much load this car can take to still be able to run this velocity. And velocity S stands for schnell, fast, meaning 100 kilometers per hour, and double S, sehr schnell, very fast, 120. And those numbers tell you how much load you can put on this wagon that it can still run 100 or 120 on this track quality. So this car here can run on a D track. Most of the tracks in the game here in Germany are quality D tracks or even higher. It can take a load of 90 tons and still run 120. It can take a load of 105 tons and still run 100. So this is what this table tells you. This other thing here tells you what kind of a brake there is in the car and the braked weight. What the braked weight is, we will see in our theory part in a couple of minutes. And you can read here that this car has 2 brakes of the kind DK. That just tells you the manufacturer and the type of brakes that they are. They have a setting G and a setting P. That's why this brake selector has a G and a P. And the A tells you that it has an automatic load change. So that means more or less that the car brakes the heavier, the more load it has, up to a maximum of 108 tons. And this is quite neat. That is the easiest for putting together the trains. There are other cars that don't react this in this automated fashion, but some have a braked weight that is always the same. Some have a braked weight where you have like a lever here, but not with a ball, but with some kind of a tilted head, where you can switch between empty and full. And if they are full, they have a higher braked weight than if they are empty. But we will look at this later in the theory part a bit, just to show you that this is actually in the game. Obviously, there are limitations. The artists that make those models, they maybe do not know everything about these inscriptions on the train, and maybe they do not have the time and budget to make it 100% exact, but that is not the problem. We try to make it as real feeling. It does not need to be real. It is a simulation. We do it for fun, not for work, and so it has to feel real. That is enough. This inscription here, by the way, it tells you how heavy this car is if it is empty. So it is close to 30 tons if it is empty already. The red one tells you how good this handbrake works. So it has a brake weight of 20 tons. It is red because it is serviced from the ground, not from the platform. And all those informations are hidden in these inscriptions and even more. Why do we need to know all that stuff? Because we need to know how to set up our brakes and in what PZB mode we are running. And the third thing, if there are limitations in our maximum velocity that we can run in certain grades, like in a downhill or uphill drive. This is the point where I want to switch to the little presentation that I prepared. I built two trains for you. The longer one on the left side, the other one on the right side. And I wanted to look into how do we know whether we have to set our brakes to G or to P or to whatever. On freight trains, this is not surprising, it can only be G or P, at least in Germany. On passenger trains it can be something else. The first thing why we have two trains here is that you have to look into your Fahrplan, into your timetable, into the order that you got from your dispatcher, and it tells you whether you are running your train in brake mode G or in brake mode P-R or /R, I think. Brake mode, in German Bremsart, is a category that tells you how fast the air gets pumped into the brake cylinders. You know that the brakes work in a way, the air brakes at least, that you pump air into the brake cylinders in every car and the locomotive, and by pumping air in the brake cylinders you press the brake pads and the brake shoes against the wheels or brake discs, and so slow down the wheels and so slow down the train. And the speed that those cylinders are filled is higher in P and R and is lower in G. And then within the two Bremsarten, brake modes, there are different brake settings. In Bremsart brake mode G, there is only the brake setting G that is working, whilst in the brake mode P and R, there are several other brake settings. It is G and P, what is interesting for our freight trains, and there is P2 and R plus MG and R plus WB, but this does not belong into Bremsart PR, it has a Bremsart of its own. And this is not what is interesting for us. So what distinguishes those brake settings from each other, G and P, P2 and R and MG? It is not the speed that you fill the brake cylinders with air, but at P and you pump them up to a higher pressure. You fill more air into the brake cylinders, so they apply more pressure at the end when they are fully filled than in brake mode, brake setting G. So in G you are slow and don't pump so much air into the brake cylinders. In P you are faster and you are well, at P actually you have the same pressure that you're ending up at first, but on the other brake settings P2 and PR you pump them up to higher pressures. The classic one is what we have seen on the brake cylinder, on the brake selector in our locomotive is R. At a certain speed the train pumps more air into the brake cylinders and applies more pressure to, well, make the brakes attack faster and slow down the train faster. P2 is more or less the same. It is some way between P and R. It pumps at a certain speed more air into the brake cylinders, but not as much as in R. R plus MG means you only have the magnet brake, that you have a magnetized shoe that you press on the rails so that the train does not only brake with the wheels but also with the magnetized shoe. But this is obviously something that only happens in passenger trains, not in freight trains. This is an eddy current brake, induction brake that does not actually work with traction between the vehicles and the track, but with magnetic fields that slow down the train. So back to what is interesting for our freight trains, we have brake settings G and P. within the brake mode PR, and we have the brake setting G within the brake mode G. And G means we are filling our cylinders slow, and P means we are filling them fast, up to the same pressure, because the brake modes that have higher pressure, like P2 and R, are not allowed in freight trains. So how do we know which vehicle we can set to G and to P? The first thing is easy. The Directive 915 of the Deutsche Bahn tells you that you have to set your brakes to the the brake setting that is indicated by the brake mode. So if you are in brake mode G, you have to set your brakes to G. And as a principle, if you are in PR as a freight train, you have to set them to P. So that results that for the first train, it does not matter if it is the locomotive, the first 5 cars in the contest, or the remaining one, or the whole train. In brake mode G, you always put everything into G. In brake mode P and R, at least up to 800 tons that your consist without the locomotive weighs. You can put everything in P. That is the simplest way. So we could just look, what does our Fahrplan tell us? In the game we don't have a timetable actually, so we wouldn't know what to do. But the simplest way were to look into the timetable and then put them into P if we read PR, or we put them into G if we read G. But it is not so simple. If you read on in the Directive 915, it tells you that for trains weighing more than 800 tons, but not more than 1,200 tons, I have to put my lead locomotive into G. The rest can run in P. So the heavier the train gets, I have to put some of my vehicles into G. And this starts at the beginning. So the locomotive is the locomotive that brakes less hard than the rest of the train. Because what I don't want to have is that the tip of my train brakes harder than the rest. Because what happens if the tip of the train brakes harder than the rest, then the rest of the train runs into the locomotive and the cars bump into each other, and at a certain point the pressure gets too hard and then the cars in the middle can derail. So that is at least one simple explanation why you don't want the tip of your train to brake harder than the end of your train. So this is why you set your loco into G and the rest in P. So the loco will brake slower than the rest. And this actually propagates on. For trains that are heavier than 1,200 tons and up to 1,600 tons, it is not enough to put the locomotive into mode G, but you also have to put the first 5 cars in the contest into G. For the same reason, you want the front of the car of the train not to brake harder than the rest. And so it is the locomotive and the first 5 cars in the contest. The rest can run in P. And this is called a long loco or large loco or LL formation, which means that the locomotive and the first 5 cars, that's why it is long or large, are in the slower brake mode G and the rest runs in P. But there are trains that are still heavier than 1,600 tons. If they are not heavier than 2,500 tons, you can do the long loco formation only if every car in the consist weighs at least 32 tons and there are no bad multiple units. A multiple unit is a combination of 2 or even more car parts, like we've seen our wagons that we are pulling here in the game. that are composed of two parts and connected with this articulated bogie that they share. And this is actually one of the cars that is a bad multiple unit. Bad multiple unit cars, this is not a technical expression, this is just an expression that I'm using, are articulated cars like the Gelenkwagen that we have here that share a bogie, or they are short coupled cars with single axles. That is complicated to explain in the game. I think we have an example for those cars, the car transport wagons, the Lyres, that we have in the game with the many cars on top of them. Those are actually bad multiple units. If you have at least one of those kind of wagons, cars in your train, then you cannot run it in the long loco formation unless everything has automatic couplers. But automatic couplers are rare in real life as far as I know, and they do not exist in the game. So if those conditions are not met, then you have to run it in G, and then you are with a train that is as heavy as that in a full G train, even if the timetable tells you that you run in brake mode PR. And then you could actually assume, at least for the game purposes, that you got a timetable that tells you to run your train in G. In the category up to 4,000 tons, it is the same, with the only difference that 32 tons for each car is not enough, but every car needs to weigh at least 40 tons. The rest of the conditions are the same. So, sounds complicated, is a bit complicated, but if you look at it a bit longer, then it is not so complicated at all. Actually, you just have to look onto your Fahrplan. In the game you can't, because you do not get one. So you look at how heavy is your train, and then you go through that. And if you end up with a train that has to run all in G, then you assume a G Fahrplan, and then you would use a Fahrplan that is set out in G. So where do we end up with our train in the game now? In our train, to know how heavy our train is, we need to sit in the driver's seat of the train, and then on the pause screen we can check how heavy our train is. Our train is 1,472.5 tons. If you go back to the table in the presentation, then you can see that is just below 1,600 tons. That means, regardless of all that stuff here, we can run it in a long loco formation. That means we have to set the locomotive in G and the first 5 cars in G. And it does not matter that our cars that we have are bad multiple units that would not allow us to run the train in long loco formation if it was heavier than 1,600 tons. Yeah, that's it. So what we have to do in the game is to set the locomotive and the first 5 cars into brake mode G. I already did this for the locomotive here, brake mode G, and we will have to do that for the cars as well. So, out with us and to the levers. And then, in addition, if we have cars like those that come in pairs, typically each pair counts as 2 cars, so that we only already have set 4 to G, and this is the 5th one, but we cannot leave 2 different brake settings on the same multiple unit. We have to put both in the same This is actually what this instruction here tells us. Achtung, stets alle GP-Wechsel umstellen. That means we cannot leave one in G and the other one in P. So we actually have to put 6 of our cars into G. To make this more easy, I built an Excel file that can be downloaded from my Discord. And this does actually those calculations for you. It looks a bit complicated, but the only thing that you have to do, you have to select your train. Like this is our Baureihe 143. And then you select what cars you have. We have in our train 20 Sggmrss. Those are the wagons that we have, where you can put the container on it. The sheet already divides it by 2 because there are 2 cars or parts in one multiple unit, and then it does all the calculations for you. It calculates the length of the train and the mass and stuff. I already have in this sheet all the consists prepared for the Dresden DLC, and our 706 freight train can be selected here. Then you press apply preset, and then you get the details for your car, for your train. And then what we already know, the sheet tells you you have to run it in LL formation. That means locomotive to G and the first 5 vehicles. And other vehicles can be set to P because we are less than 1,600 tons. We have the 40 Sggmrss because we have 20 cars in the train, 40 part cars, and they are all loaded. So the sheet calculates the length and the mass of the consist without the locomotive. With the locomotive it is obviously a bit longer and a bit more heavy, but for our brake selecting, the important thing is the cars without the locomotives that are actually working. And at the same time, the sheet calculates your Bremshunderstel, your brake percentage, and the PZB mode. Once according to what is actually written on the models, and once in red what the game tells you about those figures, because they don't always agree. Sometimes they are off, so it calculates both parallel so that you can see if there is actually a difference between what is written on the models and what the game tells you how heavy the cars are. So how do you end up here with the brake percentage and the PZB class? For that we have to look at one more presentation part. First we have our train again, and what you do, you calculate the weight of your train. You need to know how heavy it is. This is something that we have already done because we need to know that for the brake setting. And then you calculate the relevant braked weight. What is a braked weight? The braked weight is a figure that is given in tons, and it tells you, without going into details, how effectively the brakes on this car, on this vehicle, on this locomotive operate. So if they give you a high number in tons, then the brakes are very effective. If they give you a low number, then they are not so effective. And this is depending sometimes on the load. We have already discussed this. There are cars with this automatic thingy where the brake weight gets more and more the more you put in the cars, and there are some where you have to change that manually, and some have a static brake weight, and then the relevant brake weight gets modified by the brake setting, the brake mode, and the length of your train without the locomotive of your consist. Again, because this is complicated, I put them in my Excel file, and you can see here these -5% and minus 25%, it already calculates all the relevant changes in the braked weight. I called it braked mass here because it actually is a mass, but traditionally you call it braked weight. Does not matter if you call it mass or weight. The calculations, the subtractions are done in the sheet automatically. And then you put it all together, divide the relevant braked weight through the mass or by the mass, and then multiply it by 100, and then you end up with your Bremshundertstel, your brake percentage. And according to these brake percentages, you can find your PZB mode. If you are in brake mode G, then it does not matter how much brake percentage you have, you will always end up in the lowest PZB mode U. If you are in the faster P and R brake mode, you will have to look at your brake percentage at your Bremshunderstel. If they are lower than 66, you will run in PZB U. If you are between 66 up to 110, you will end up in M. And if you are higher than 110, you will run in PZB mode O. AJ, did I knock you off your chair, or are you still with me? It sounds complicated. It is not so complicated if you look at it like 3, 4 or 5 times. Obviously in real life it is even more complicated, but the general principle is something that I think you can even grasp if you're just a dilettante like me playing on a simulator. And for me it is always interesting to see how those things work, at least in principle. So let's take the presentation out of the way, go back to our game. And we know now why we ended up in PZB mode M. Like here, for example, is the marking on the locomotive that tells us the braked weight of the locomotive for every brake setting. Like G has 67 tons, P 81 tons, R 95 tons, and this is with the dynamic brake, with the electric brake, while those 83 tons is the mass of our locomotive. And this you do for the locomotive and every car in the consist, and then you can calculate your brake percentage if all the markings are correct. And to show you that the sheet that I made does all this for you, I will just go back to it for a little while and just show you what happens. With our cars that we have in this train, they are loaded in our consist that we are running. Just imagine they are not loaded, put them to empty. The mass of the cars drops to the almost 30 tons that was written on the sides. Also the braked mass, because they are automatically adjusting the brake weight. So not a lot changes actually. We are still in PZB M. No matter if they are loaded or if they are unloaded. If you had like other cars, like tank cars, Sggmrss, there it makes a big difference whether they are loaded, then you end up in PZB U in the lowest, because the braked weight is still much lower than the mass of the cars. Or if they are empty, because if they are empty, then the brake weight is actually higher than their mass, and you end up in PZB M. But back to our train. This is our formation 706 from Dresden to Riesa. We are running in PZB M with 90 brake percentage. Those brake percentages are also relevant for the question how fast a train can go in a certain gradient. There are tables that tell you that, and if you do all the calculations, what is difficult and complicated, it ends up in a Fahrplan like this, telling you from which point in the track you have a reduced speed, and all the speeds that result from your brake percentage in a certain gradient result in those white on black markings in the Fahrplan. So actually our train has a reduced maximum speed in certain parts with a gradient in our DLC on our road compared to a train with a higher brake percentage. And these Fahrpläne that my friend OpenMinded created, they just give you those calculations for specific parts in the track. All that you wouldn't know if you just drive your train with the custom setup and hope that everything is well. Now let's set up actually the locomotive. We have to put in the reverser, then we can turn on the headlights, also the instrument lights, and then we can go for the brake setup. Actually, this is the independent brake or direct brake here. For some reason the handle is always in front of the gauge that tells you about the brake cylinders. I want to apply it fully because I want to release the brakes. You can see that the pressure in the brake cylinders is actually rising. Don't forget to unlock the brakes. There is a working brake key that needs to be put to on, otherwise you cannot operate this handle, and then we can start releasing the brakes. You can see that on this big gauge here, the yellow hand telling you about the pressure in the brake pipe is going to 5 and a bit, and the red one telling you about the main reservoir close to 10. The brake cylinders are still full because the direct brake is on hold. What still is there to set up? I think we set up the CIFA and all the other stuff. Yes, already the PZB is lighting up. We can set the reverser to forward. And now we all know the BR143 has this weird force selector and speed selector combination. The thing is, if you don't use the auxiliary drive, you put in a certain speed, like for example, you want the train to go 50 because the signals are telling us 60 is the speed that we are aiming for, or even the 60, and then it should go and try to go to 60. You have a force selector telling the train how much force it can use, and this selects not only the traction force but also the brake force. And when you're starting your train, especially a heavy freight train, you always want to put the force selector below the 100%, like 60 or 70 or something in between. Otherwise you will get wheel slips. Your train cannot start because the locomotive is pulling and pulling and pulling, and it cannot move the cars, and so the connection between the wheels and the rails will give way and you will slip. Why is it not running, our locomotive? Even though we put the speed selector on 60 and we have a force selector on a speed, why is it not running? Well, we can see that the engine is not actually running. This double-digit 00 tells you about the so-called Fahrstufe. If this is going up, then the engine is actually trying to apply force on the track. It is not doing that because we have still too much pressure in our brake cylinders. The train won't start to apply traction force on the track unless the brake cylinder pressure has dropped below about 1 bar. So let's try to do that and release the independent brakes, and then whoop, are we actually standing here without any brakes on? There is an Anfahrbremse, starting brake. Don't get confused, the captions here of the in-game are swapped around. We are not using the brake bridging, we are using the starting brake. And the starting brake actually applies some pressure in the brake cylinders that are below the 1 bar, so that the train will start off and try to apply force. So if I move the force selector to the 60 now, you can actually see that these numbers are going up. The train is trying to apply force, and we are moving. The Anfahrbremse actually did not hold the train in place completely, but it was important so that the train does not start rolling backwards. And now we can set our train in motion. That was the CIFA here. Don't overdo it with the speed selector. What I wanted to demonstrate here, but I wanted to go back to the cab. If you overdo it with the traction force in the beginning, you will always get wheel slips, and then you cannot apply any force anymore. But I wanted to show that when we are actually in the cab. So, back to applying force. We are running with close to 20 kilometers, and on this dial here you can see how much traction force the train is trying to apply. If I move the force selector up, we are applying more traction force to the track. If I move it downwards, less. If you go beyond the 40 here, if you think, okay, we can apply more and more power and go beyond the 40, you will get wheel slips. Your wheels will start actually turning around itself, not applying any more pressure. I will demonstrate that. You can see those hands and also the hand on the speed clock jump around when I apply too much pressure, too much force too fast. You see, it is jumping around. We are getting wheel slips. If that is getting too worse, actually the speed clock jumps around, and this will result in more and more heavy wheel slips, and a certain end, then the train will come to a stop because it can't handle it anymore. So not so much power in the beginning. Don't go over the 40, because this will not only stall your train but also damage your wheels. PZB M is 70. Next thing we have to stop, because we have still some theory to look at. We have seen PZB O, we have seen PZB M, but we have not seen what PZB M means. We have seen PZB O, we have seen PZB U, but not PZB M. That's where I want to go. PZB O. You remember that from the streams before? What you have to do if you encounter a yellow caution signal, 10 to 70, or if you're traveling fast enough, 80 to 90, you have to hit the Wachsamkeitstaste, you get into 1000 Hertz, and then you have to slow down to 80 within 23 seconds. On a stop signal, then there will be also the 500 Hertz. We have looked at PZB U, where everything is modified. You have to go down to 50 within 38 seconds. And the same for the 500. And PZB M actually is in between. Everything happens like it is happening in PZB O and PZB U. The difference is you have 29 seconds to drop to 65. Again, the Actual limit is 70. If you go below the 70, you won't get the penalty brake, but you are required by the directives that you keep 5 kilometers below that limit as a safety margin, so you have to aim for 65. 45 before you hit the 500 magnets, 500 hertz magnet, and to 30 within the 500 hertz monitoring. That does not sound so crazy because you can't go faster than 120 in PZB mode M. To drop to 70 seems not as hard as it sounds like dropping from 100 to 50 in PZB mode U, but within 29 seconds. And we will see that this is actually quite harsh, or can be quite harsh, especially if you're running a heavy train like we are. Going back to the train. We are getting 1000 hertz here because another 60 was announced. So we are actually in our 1000 hertz monitoring. We have to keep below the 70, what is not a problem because we are only traveling 60. So that your train does not overshoot the 60 that you selected on the speed selector, I am reducing the force on the force selector as soon as I'm going close to 60. And then I can reduce it to 0 so that I don't overshoot. Or another thing that this locomotive allows, you can go to a program that is called a conditional run. That means as soon as the 60 is reached, the Fahrstufen will go down and no more traction will be applied. We will look into this later again, maybe. Now we are parsing a sign for 80, that is okay, we can go the 80 then. But we have to wait until our train is past the sign. Unfortunately, we do not have a road runner like on the Baureihe 182, so we have to make do with what we have. And what we have is a great view here. Just give you that. Crossing the river Elbe with Dresden in the background, the historic city. And those are those last auto carrier cars that are also bad MUs. Obviously you have to apply the force selector again if you want to accelerate. Always with an eye on the force meter here so that you don't go beyond the 40. And with a combination of setting the desired speed and adjusting the force selector, you can run the trains with the 143 quite precisely to your maximum velocities. You remember here is a descent, so we won't go too close to the 80 here in the descent. Maybe we will accelerate to 70 and then reduce the power a bit. It is also important if you're running heavy trains across grades where you're first running uphill and then running downhill. You always have to reduce the force a bit on the locomotive so that the tip of your train doesn't get too fast compared with the end of your train. Otherwise you will run the risk of separating your train because the tip is running downhill fast and the end is running uphill slow, and this way break the couplers and you don't want to do that. But now we are down this little slope and we can apply more force again. The trains that you can see here on the other tracks, they had to wait for us because all of my explanations at the beginning of the stream, time went past, and all the trains that wanted to come into Dresden Hauptbahnhof are now waiting on their red signals. You might have noticed that we passed a sign with 100 and then another sign with 160, what allows us to go for maximum speed here. Maximum speed on our PZB M train is 120. If you calculate the 5 kilometers margin of error, but you will see that with our Baureihe 143 we won't actually be able to reach this speed of 120, not even on level ground, but we can go really full throttle here. You might have noticed that the Fahrstufenanzeige does not go higher than 31. That is all that this locomotive can do. And also in our Fahrplan, on this part of the track we can go 120. We might be able to overtake this S-Bahn train on the right, because this train has to stop and we don't need to stop. You can see we are giving full throttle for Selector to the max, and we are still not higher than 100, far away from our maximum. This actually makes us think, is our locomotive really strong enough to pull this long and heavy train? If you look at it from the outside, this train is really long. It has 20 units of those flatbeds. Looks like 40 cars. And this makes this train really heavy for German standards, for European standards. And we only have the little 143. This might not be so problematic when it is just about accelerating, but it might pose a problem if we have to slow down this train. You can see the closer we're actually getting to the target speed, and I cannot set a higher target speed than 120, the Fahrstufenanzeige drops. What is okay, so that we don't overshoot the mark. Here is an intercity with the Baureihe 101. And now we are running in the part of the track where we are going downhill. This is why we are actually accelerating. And to not overshoot the 115 that our timetable tells us here to go, what I like to do is to actually set the desired speed below, move the force selector to 0 and then wait, and let's see where the train is going. And if it is actually going backwards, I can set the speed back to where I want to go and apply some traction force. And if not, if the train is actually running away, you can set your speed under your current speed and play with the force selector to use the electric brakes to slow your train down. So at the moment I am aiming for 115 kilometers. I set the speed to 120 and playing with the fourth selector to pull the speed up to 110 maybe, because the limit of 115 I keep a margin of error of safety of 5 kilometers, because I know that now we are running downhill, and running downhill accelerates this train heavily. You can see that it is climbing, the needless climbing towards the 115, and I probably don't want to do that. So I set the speed to 100 and play with the fourth selector to apply the electric brakes. Here you can see the application of the electric brakes. If the needle goes to the left, we are applying brake force. From the hectometric signs, I can see where on the track I am. Kilometer 105 and what is the next number, 200 meters. That tells us that we are closing into a part of the track where we are going into an uphill part, and you can see that the train is already slowing down again, and I don't want to slow the train to slow it down too heavily, so I put the speed again above our speed and play with the fourth selector to keep the speed as close to the 115 that I am allowed to go as possible. I have no idea if this is something that you can do in real life on this locomotive. On the simulator, in the simulation, it actually works like a charm. If you put the speed or the selected speed on the speed that you actually want to go, the train always goes down with its Fahrwerkstufen and you will never be able to reach it. So if that happens, I put the speed above or below and play with the fourth selector to pull the speed in the direction that I want. Now we are going uphill. We can see we are slowing down even if I have everything on full throttle. Selected speed 120 and the fourth selected to 120. And still the train is slowing down. But you will see as soon as we are across the summit and going downhill, then the train will start to run. And at this point I'm already concerned that my braking capacity on this train is enough to slow it down. Especially, you just have to imagine we get a yellow signal, we have to slow down below the 70 to 65, and we should do a test when running downhill if we are actually capable of doing this on this train. The numbers that we had in our sheet, and they are valid. It is okay to run this train in PZB M and with those velocities, but we will see if it actually works. Probably not. If you want to force your train to go up with a Fahrwerkstufen, you can always use the Hilfssteuerung, like this one. And then you can push it and force it into the highest Fahrwerkstufe 31. You always have to be careful though, because just adjusting the speed does not override this. So you will still running with full power even if you set the speed to a slower speed. You have to turn it off and turn it on again to delete what you set with the auxiliary control. At the moment everything is no problem. We can run with highest force uphill and are still far away from the 120 that we can go here according to our timetable. And uphill it is not the problem if we get a yellow or a flashing green. Uphill, I have no doubt that we would be able to get the train below the 70 within the 29 seconds that PZB M allows. The announced reduction in track speed to 140 is totally irrelevant for us. We don't have to acknowledge it, and we will never run faster than this. What you see in that is that it is not only important for you to know your speed profile on your track, but also the elevation profile, so that you know when you will be running uphill, when you will be running downhill, and to be prepared that your heavy train will be pushing you downhill like crazy and slowing you down when you're running uphill. So, if I remember the track correctly, then we will be passing this area with the houses close to the track and run into a more woody area, and there will be the summit and the end of this uphill run. And then it will be interesting if our train is actually able to slow down to 70 from a speed of 110 and 115 when running downhill within the 29 seconds. We will definitely test this before we go further here. I guess those are the last dwellings on this side of the pass. Also, if you want to prepare for slowing down your train, it's always important that you get rid of the Fahrwerkstufen first, because as long as the train is actually applying traction force here, then it cannot use the electric brakes, and those are precious seconds. So there is a bridge, and after the bridge it is very, very short until we reach the summit, and we will be going into a descent and running downhill. Now we are going downhill. You will see the train accelerating very soon. And as soon as the train starts accelerating, I will turn off. Now it is starting to accelerate. You can see it, needle is moving through the 100. I turn off the propulsion. You can see the Fahrwerkstufen going down to 0, and the way I'm trying to do this test, this brake test, is I wait here on the clock until we are at 55, and then I start applying the brake, simulating that I have 5 seconds after seeing the yellow signal until I actually pass it, like now. And now I apply full brakes, full service brakes, not an emergency but full brakes, and the force selector that also selects the brake for us to 120. So I cannot do more brakes without going into an emergency brake. And I should get below 70 before the timer goes to 29. And it is already at 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29. Bang! Now the penalty brake application would go in, because we are still beyond the 80. We are at 84, 85. There is no way that we could have made this within the time limit given by PZB M. Okay, something must be wrong here. This train cannot run on this timetable with PZB M. What actually went wrong, I do not know. It can be that the train in the simulation actually does not have the brake percentage, the brake weight that is written on its side, that is given in the sources. Maybe our brake tables or our gradient numbers are not correct. At least I know now that my brakes are not good enough to slow down within the limits that are set out by the PZB M regime. And what will I do? I will apply for myself a limit of not running faster than 100 if I am going downhill, because otherwise I won't be able to stop my train before I get a Zwangsbremsung, and I don't want to have that. So if you look at the profile, it is quite okay. For the next couple of kilometers we can run with the allowed speed of 115 here according to Fahrplan. But as soon as we are getting into a descent, we should stick more to the 100 than to the 115, otherwise we cannot react to yellow signals. There is one more interesting part when we get back to the main line. At the moment we are at the avoiding line, where we are limited to 105 according to our Fahrplan. But at the moment we are allowed to go 115, and the grade is not so heavy that I am concerned that we cannot stop in case we're getting a yellow signal. At first we are running uphill again anyway, so no qualms to go full throttle again. Then we will be going downhill a bit, because we are going down on the other side of this bridge here, where we are going across the other line, and then the same thing repeats or gets repeated. For the moment we can enjoy the nice scenery in the Dresden DLC. What is a great DLC, not only because of all the brake setup possibilities, definitely one of the best that there are in the game. Soon we will be running downhill for a bit. As soon as we are beyond this bridge, across this street, and preparing for the slowdown to 105. I just let the train run here because I know that we will be running into a short uphill part, and this should be enough to stop our train or slow down our train to the 105 that we are allowed in this part. So at the moment I just let it coast. I still have a buffer of 5 kilometers per hour to the 115 that the Fahrplan allows here. And if it is climbing too hard, I can always try to catch it back with the e-brake. Just set the speed below your current speed and use the force selector to see how hard your train is trying to get the speed back. Now the Fahrplan allows us 105 starting from here. The slope is slowing us down to 100. We are over this little hill, starting here, and now the train is running downhill. And if you think, okay, no problem, I just let it coast, you should look at your speed clock, because the train is picking up speed like crazy in this part here. It is quite a steep slope downhill. It is not long, but it is really steep. And if you don't watch out, you will get shot into this main line and accelerating heavily. You can see it already, how the needle is creeping upwards, and now I am applying braking force to the max to not let the needle climb below or above the 105 until the whole train. Remember, we have 20 pairs of these cars behind us, and they all take their time until they are through the descent. And if we look at our profile here, we can see we are in a long descent. We are running downhill all the time. And from what we learned from our brake test, we won't be able to slow down the train below the 70 if we go 110 or 115 on a slope like this. So we will limit ourselves to 100 here and just let the train run down the slope with 100. And you can see that the electric brakes are still working and trying to slow down the train. I set the speed to 100 and put the force selector to a significant number, and the train is just working not to let the needle climb anymore. This just gives you an idea about how heavily this train behind you is pushing. Is pushing you down the slope. You have to apply a brake force with the electric brakes of 50 kilonewton to not make it accelerate. There is not even thinking of slowing down the train here. This is the chemical plant with the V60 waiting. and we are going on with our downhill race. That is not a nice view. All those containers with their heavy load are pushing us, and there is not more than our little Baureihe 143 to stop it or slow it down. And from our Fahrplan we know that we have to go to Röderau in the end. That means we have to diverge from this track after the next station, and we will probably have to slow down for that to 60, because that is the maximum speed that we can go there. So we will have to slow down. That means I will yank in the brakes to max, the air brakes, not only the e-brakes that are already working. Let's see where we are getting. This is the next station, Glaubitz bei Riesa. The slope is lessening a bit. You can see that the e-brakes is working less hard to keep us to 100. But still, to slow down the train actually is another story. So it's 3.8 kilometers to Röderau, and now we have to get prepared for slowing down the train. We could obviously start slowing down the train now so that we hit the 60, but let's wait before until we get a signal telling us to do that, and try to react really fast. And there is a flashing yellow. Full brakes for Selector 120%. This is a flashing yellow HL signal telling us to prepare for a speed limit of 60 or 40. And in PZB M, 70 is flashing. We have to go down to the 70 within the 29 seconds. And let's hope that this is enough brake power. 80, 75, 70, no penalty brake. Okay. Traction lock, we have to reset our speed selector. And here is the signal telling us 60 from here. We are at 40. The next one will be a slow one too. 60 or 40. Next 1000 Hertz. And now we're closing in to the diverging line to the junction to Röderau. And I'm not going faster than 60 here. Yeah. Imagine us going 115 at this spot, yanking in the brakes, and there would have been no way to slow down below the 70 within the 29 seconds. Switch to the right. 1.2 kilometers to go until we have to stop. So I can actually already start thinking about reducing the speed even more. last kilometer. I let the electric brakes work, set the speed to 10 while driving with 40 to make the electric brakes work, and you can see that it takes a lot of effort to slow down this train. Here's the HL signal telling us 60 now, stop later. So we will be running into 500 Hertz. We need to be at 35. Okay, we did that. That is accomplished. Let's see how far we can get with our electric brake. The effectiveness of the electric brake will decrease rapidly with velocities so slow, so we will have to use some air brake too. As soon as I activate the air brakes, the speed selector is rendered irrelevant. Not so the brake force selector, because for the blended in air brake electric brakes it is still relevant even if the speed selector is off. Now I've got the 500 Hertz. No problem with the speed limit, but now we have to get this train to a stop in front of the red signal, and because this beast is pushing us so hard, I will just make sure that I get really slow in the end. You can see I'm applying brake and brake and brake, and the train is pushing on and pushing on and pushing on. And now I go full. Yeah, on the 1 meter mark. That's it for today. A lot of theory, a lot of confusing stuff about brake setting, about brake percentages and so on. I tried to, well, give you a short overview and how to use our tool that OpenMinded and me designed to make it easier to do all those calculations for the services in this DLC. We might have to update it for the Trains SimWorld 3 universe, where we have freight trains running on the German route that is there in the core routes. We will see how this works out. We will have to look into it first, and we have to, well, look into all the gradients and stuff. Thank you for bearing with me through all this heavy stuff, and yeah, I'm happy that we got this train to a stop and did not run the last red signal. Take care and see you soon.